reason we want people to want to do it is because we need to report everything.
Correct. Right.
So you'll need to read this one. You'll need to find the question in the long preambles.
You got it. I can do that. Thank you. All right, as people trickle in here, I will introduce our second panel and get us started. I'm Lindsay Wickstrom, and I'm really grateful to be here. So thank you to Alan and the university for hosting the symposium and for inviting me to moderate. I'm starting because I'm also interested in lunch later on. So I wanted to remind everyone here that we don't have microphones for questions, so it's really important that you use this QR code now. So I would scan it while you have the opportunity here in case questions come up during the talks, and we won't have it on the screen as the speakers are giving their presentations. So I invite you to scan this code, and then I will read your questions from the iPad during the conversation. All right. So this second panel today is called Resilient Forests, Responsive Structures, Signals from Natural Systems. And like I mentioned, thank you to Alan for the invitation to moderate with all of these fantastic panelists today. So I'm Lindsay Wickstrom. I wrote a book called Designing the Forest and Other Mass Timber Futures. The book is about inviting young people, especially, so students, into the space of designing with regenerative materials and opening up what we've been already talking about today is the supply chain and the externalities of design. Instead of when you write a word in an annotation that says timber, you understand what that implies. And this was a way to give a primer to folks that are interested. I've also moderated talks on this topic across different platforms, including Material Worlds at MoMA, which was born out of the pandemic and the launch of a new institute at MoMA. And it was an interesting time to be talking about the future of all materials. Much like we've heard today, concrete isn't going anywhere, so what are the innovations? What do we need to be thinking about? What's at stake in general? So that's a little bit about my background and why I'm interested in hosting this panel. And today's topic, I think, is perfectly titled, to situate our fantastic speakers and their expertise, especially the phrase signals from natural systems. One might interpret this to mean, and I'm interested to talk about this later, what does the forest want us to do? What does nature want humans to do? Are we listening? So many folks might very quickly assume that nature wants us to back off, just do nothing. And somehow nothing is the most important thing that we could do. Restraint is somehow of great import today. But I wouldn't agree so quickly that no action somehow promises this best outcome for nature. I think this is a fairly old and inaccurate narrative that we might too quickly tell ourselves. It's concerning. It's a narrative that continues to divide us, this dichotomy between man and nature, cities and landscapes, when in fact, as you've already seen, the relationship is so interconnected and intertwined that describing the most ethical way forward is really challenging. It's the most challenging thing that faces us today. So might our conviction about nature and biodiversity change if we consider ourselves to be part of nature? Might we act differently if we don't see that strong divide? If we consider ourselves and the cities and landscapes to be part of one carbon cycle, one relationship that crosses generations as well? So as a practicing architect, my firm is called Metaforma. We're based in New York. I find this expertise of sourcing knowledge, sourcing materials, sourcing ideas to be incredibly powerful, but incredibly invisible. It has this backroom quality where you might not give an award to an architect for not doing anything or for extreme restraint, showing that that big pile of money that could have been this massive building actually was a third of the size it was originally planned. So the way that we think about value and ethics is being rewritten right now. We're at the beginning of a new material era, and I would say we are in such an amazing place today, and the symposium is so critical for launching into that new era. So first, we'll hear today from Mark Palahi, and responses then from Andrew Wah, Tanya Luthi, and Keel Mo, all extremely distinguished in their own right, and all involved in ushering in this new material era and what it means. But first, I'll introduce Mark. Mark specifically is Chief Nature Officer from Lombard ODA Investment Managers, a super fascinating position to be in the world when we're thinking of changing hearts and minds, and a CEO of Circular Bioeconomy Alliance, among many other accolades and interesting positions he finds himself in today. So please join me in welcoming Mark to give our Impulse talk.
Thank you very much, Lindsay and Alan. Thank you for organizing this great conference. Dear ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure to be with all of you here today. So in the next minutes, I would like to share with all of you some reflections and some facts about why and how we should be transitioning towards a nature-first economy, what some of us call a circular bioeconomy, an economy that is powered by nature and prospers in harmony with nature. But let me start first with a few basic ideas. And the first and most important is that nature explains our planet. Nature is what makes our planet special. Nature is the keystone infrastructure that regulates our planetary system, including our climate, the food that we eat, the water that we drink, and the air that we breathe. Nature is the basic fabric supporting all living processes on Earth, including all our economic activities. Even if our economic system does not realize that, because bees, birds, and trees, they do not send bills to us. Also because our economic system derives value from price rather than price from value. The problem is that because our economy has failed to value nature, now we are paying for the cost of its destruction. But nature, as Lindsay mentioned, nature also defines us. We are an integral part of nature, even if most definitions of nature define it against everything that is human or human-made. In fact, we are the result of millions of years of evolution in the most sophisticated laboratory in the planet, our forest. Let me explain you why. Because before trees evolved and forests expanded more than 400 million years ago, our planet, life, the climate, was radically different. In fact, the climate was 10 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today, and the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere was almost 10 times what it is today. So not really a habitable planet for a species like ours. But with the expansion of forests, the miracle happened. The destiny of life and our own destiny changed, because forests operate following ecologies of scale. They use solar energy at scale to transform CO2 and water into renewable biochemical energy that can be utilized by many other organisms. All that while releasing oxygen and recirculating water in the atmosphere and underground. Still today, in many continents, 50% of the rainfall comes directly from forest evapotranspiration. So what happened? With forest, the planet changed. It was transformed and it became habitable for a species like ours. This explains why our first ancestors evolved 7-8 million years ago inside the forest, interacting with trees. We, our physiognomy, our genetics, is the result of all these millions of years of evolution inside the forest. This is why I like to say that this is the planet of the trees, not the planet of the apes. And maybe this also explains why the tree of life is an archetype, a symbol that is repeated across all religions and cultures in the world. You find it in Genesis in the Bible, but also in the Buddhist and the Hindu tradition, in the Amazon cosmology, in the Nordic mythology, Most indigenous cultures worship the tree of life. So, why I'm saying all that? I think it's very important to know where we are coming from now that we are destroying the very system that gave birth to us. And it is also very important to understand the transformative nature of nature, forests, and trees now that we need to transform our world if we want still this planet to be habitable for a species like us. Because the issue is that we have reached a tipping point in human history. And this tipping point is the result of more than 200 years operating under an extractive economy powered by fossil resources. An economy that is true has resulted in unprecedented economic growth, urbanization, and technological development. But all that development has been at the expense of nature, climate, and our own future. Remember one thing, we have changed the climate of our planet for the first time in human history. And we are crossing its resilience boundaries due to the massive loss of biodiversity, the degradation of our natural and managed ecosystems, and the accumulation of pollutants of different types. The problem when you cross the safe operating space of our planet, like we are doing, is that all these different risks that you see here start accelerating each other. When we are losing our forests, we are not only losing the largest terrestrial carbon sink, one of the main sources for oxygen and water, but we are releasing huge amounts of carbon to the atmosphere that will accelerate climate change and natural disturbances like wildfires, which will in turn destroy more forests and release more carbon. So you enter into a vicious cycle like the one we are in now. Also, when you cross the safe operating the space of the planet as we are doing today, to make it in very simple terms, what happens is that our environment cannot absorb any longer for the shocks that our economy is generating, which means in turn that our economy is the one that needs to absorb its own shocks. And this is what is already happening today. If you look at the figure on the left, you will see that global insured losses as a result of climate change and nature degradation has doubled in the last 10 years compared to the previous 10 years. Now the new normal of global insured losses due to these catastrophic climate-driven events is above 100 billion per year. This has been consistently been the case for the last 5 years. And probably this year is going to be a record because in one event already, the LA wildfires, it is estimated that around $35 billion in insured losses happen. But of course, these insured losses is just one indicator. The overall economic losses are much greater. The natural capital losses are much greater. You all remember the wildfires in Canada in 2023. Alan was mentioning them before. Probably you saw the smoke from here. Wildfires in Canada that year burned almost 20 million hectares of forest. They released the equivalent of 3.5 times the greenhouse emissions of Canada in 1 year, in just a few months. What is the true cost of that? What is clear is all economic sectors, all countries are going now to experience the combined impacts of climate change and nature destruction. Of course, some sectors are going to be more exposed, more sensitive, those that are dependent more directly on weather conditions and the state of natural capital. And obviously, our food systems is at the center of this perfect storm. Recent science estimates that food inflation due to climate change will be increasing at a global average of 4% almost every year for the next 10 years. And in fact, we are seeing already food value chain disruptions due to the combined effects of climate change and nature degradation. Last year, probably you all saw how cocoa prices increased by more than 250% because cocoa production in West Africa collapsed due to climate change, natural disturbances, and the degradation of these cocoa landscapes. This year, we are seeing now recently how coffee commodity prices have doubled in the last 12 months. Again, because producing countries like Brazil or Vietnam are experiencing now these compound effects of climate change and nature degradation. But the food systems is not only a victim of the nature and climate crisis, it's also one of the main causes. Remember that the way we produce food, the way we transform and manage our landscapes to produce food is releasing 1/3 of the greenhouse emissions and responsible for 90% of the global deforestation. So it's both a cause and a victim. And I think the same is happening with our cities and our urban environments. And this has been mentioned before. Our cities are both a main cause and a main victim of the nature and climate crisis. the way we build and live in our cities is a main driver for climate change and nature destruction. But the way we build and live in our cities is also exposing urban populations to a much higher risk of climate change and nature destruction. So it is quite clear that we need to rethink our landscapes, rural and urban, and the production and consumption systems connected to them if we want our world to prosper within the planetary boundaries. But to do that, above all, we need to rethink our economy around nature. We need to understand, value, and invest in nature as what it is, the true engine of our economy. And this is not going to be easy because that requires a paradigm shift from an extractive mindset towards a regenerative mindset. It requires moving from an extractive economy powered by fossil resources, an economy that develops at the expense of nature, climate, and our own health, towards a regenerative economy that is powered by nature and prospers in harmony with nature. This is not just nice rhetoric. This is about understanding the laws that govern our planet, like the laws of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics, for instance, explain that when our climate gets 1 degree warmer, and we are beyond that, the atmosphere contains 7% more moisture. This is clear thermodynamics, which means that in dry areas, the atmosphere is going to suck 7% more water, becoming drier. It means that when it drains 7% more water, more floods. So thermodynamics explain why we are seeing more frequent and intense droughts and floods, sometimes in the same region, like in California. So this is thermodynamics. Above that, we need to also understand what we have done in these 200 years, because we have shifted the thermodynamics of the planet. And this is very important that you understand, because in these 200 years, what has happened is that we have moved from an open economic system prior to the industrial era, an open economic system relying on an external source of energy, the sun, reliable, constant, external source of energy, towards a closed economic system powered by finite fossil resources which are internal to the system. What happens when you use fossil resources? You liberate a lot of energy and also entropic byproducts in the form of greenhouse emissions, which are sealing the atmosphere and creating a rather closed system. Now, if you know about the second law of thermodynamics, it is very clear what happened with free energy in a closed system. It results in irreversibility, disorder, and entropy. And this is what is happening today. All this entropy, all this disorder is coming back to us in the form of environmental and economic risks. So there is no other way to get out of this vicious cycle than go back to an open system. And to do that, nature is our best strategy and reliable partner. Because remember what I told you before about forests. Nature is the interface between us and the sun. Nature translates solar energy into renewable biochemical energy and matter that we can use across our economy if we use the right regenerative approaches. And this is exactly what it is, the nature-first economy, a circular bioeconomy. It's basically an economy that ultimately is powered by the sun. It is an economy that understands, values, and invests in biodiversity and nature-based solutions as the true engine of the economy. It is an economy that creates regenerative landscapes, both rural and urban, and we need to overcome the current dichotomy between the two of them, as basis for circular bioeconomy production and consumption systems that prosper within the planetary boundaries. The good news is that we have the knowledge, we have the technology to build an entire new economy anchored in nature-based solutions as basis for circular bioeconomy products that can replace and environmentally and economically outperform fossil-based products across industries like food, construction, fashion, transport, chemicals, pharma. We obviously have the knowledge to produce food using ecological principles and biological inputs instead of synthetic ones. We can produce coffee and cocoa, coming back to the previous example, using agroforestry systems, where we use trees as the input. And by doing so, we are creating a system that not only produces coffee and cocoa, but is sequestering carbon, supporting biodiversity, and building resilience in the landscape and therefore in the supply chain. So nature is our best insurance. And we obviously have the knowledge and the technology to transform wood, the most versatile material on Earth, a natural battery, to transform it in advanced biomaterials to replace polyester in the fashion industry, carbon fiber or plastics in the car industry through materials like nanocellulose. And as you all know, we can transform wood in wood engineering products, which can help us to transform cities and buildings into carbon storage infrastructures. Now the challenge is we need to bring all these innovations, technologies, and knowledge at a global economy scale. And this is going to be extremely challenging because we are talking about the greatest economic transformation in human history. If you look at the speed that we need to put forward, at the scale, and the mindset shift that this requires, we have never done it in the past, something of this scale. And this is why I believe that cities need to take a leading role, a catalytic role, not only because the way we build and live in our cities have a clear implication in our economy, nature, and climate, but especially, and you know this very well, because cities are the mirrors of society. They are not only the innovation hubs, they are the inspirational hubs. Winston Churchill used to say that we shape our buildings, then they shape us. I think we can extrapolate this idea to the level of cities. We shape our cities, and then they shape our world. They shape our economy. They shape the way we live, the way we consume, the way we think, the way we dream. And this is why cities are so important. We are storytellers. We need our cities to tell a new and different story, and a story about the future, but also about the past of ourselves as a species. They need to tell a story that this is the planet of the trees, not the planet of the apes. They need to explain to the world that forests are the cities of nature, and we need to seek inspiration in our forests to rethink the cities of the 21st century. So to end, a few key messages or concluding remarks. A nature-first economy, which is also a people's first economy, because we are an integral part of nature, is about investing in nature to transform our economy, rather than to offset for its failure. This is very important. We need to move from offsetting tactics to insetting transformative strategies. A nature-first economy is also the best long-term strategy to avoid the unmanageable, but also is the best short-term strategy to manage the unavoidable. Scientists predicted rather well climate change. We underestimated the impacts of climate change. That was too difficult. The scary thing of climate change is not what we know, but what we don't know. But we know one thing, that nature has been delivering solutions in a changing environment for billions of years. So we should be humble enough to take advantage of that. And to finish, I believe that our greatest challenge is not the lack of knowledge, lack of technology, lack of regulations, not even the lack of finance. Our greatest challenge is here, is the collective extractive mindset that has resulted after these 200 years of industrial fossil-based era. And if we want to change our mindset and move towards a regenerative mindset, we need to understand that nature does not belong to us, that we belong to nature. We need to understand that nature is complex, but is not complicated. It follows very simple principles, like the principle of unity in diversity, where biodiversity is the true engine, the ultimate engine of life. It follows the principle of resilience. In nature, efficiency follows resilience, like mitigation follows adaptation, like carbon follows biodiversity. And finally, nature is not outcome-based, it's process-based. And the only permanent process in nature is change, is evolution, because nature is the constant flow of energy from its purest form, light, to its most complex form, which is life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we'll have Andrew Waugh, founding director of Waugh Thistleton Architects, based in the UK, award-winning practice, if you don't know of them already, which I'm sure you do, dedicated to delivering not only beautiful buildings, but largely biogenic places. And he's world-renowned and also being an advocate and architect, leading projects across Europe and the US and many other accolades. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. So this is us. There we go. This is us. We're Wortheston Architects. As Lindsay said, we're a practice based in London in the UK. And for the last 24 years, thinking about seeing how we can build more buildings. The reason why we focus on timber is because we see that as a viable alternative to many of the issues that have been raised in terms of the carbon reduction, building a different relationship and with nature. And that is no. I think it's in metric. I think that must be the kind of like.
I want to use the.
Should use the arrow. Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Alan. And I just put this up, and we've seen loads of graphs today. And when I start talking about our work, and it's really important for me to reintroduce or to introduce the fact that the reason why we do what we do is because of the climate emergency, the climate crisis which we find ourselves within. And that isn't a theoretical position. That's not something that is happening in the future. That's happening right now. And that is about the forest fires we've heard about this morning, about the droughts and the floods, the mass migration. But it's also about the right-wing governments. It's also about the changes that we're seeing in politics and in our society. And so as a practice, that's something that we talk about as much as we can. We talk about, we wear that on our shoulder, we protest, we march, we talk. Whenever anybody will listen to us, we talk about a different kind of architectural practice. A kind of practice which isn't about an individual vanity, but a practice which is about a social service. An architecture which thinks about success in different ways. It doesn't think about success as being the tallest and the shiniest and the biggest, but it talks about a success that is about being the healthiest, about thinking about how we can be low carbon, that talks about the people that work and live in our buildings. And that is very much a collaborative process. That's something that we work on closely with engineers, with our clients, with contractors, with foresters, with manufacturers. That's one which is about constant innovation, always thinking about how we can improve and change. And that's also one about beauty. This isn't an exercise in compromise. This is an exercise in finding a better future and finding a future which can work within our planetary boundaries, but also as a future which is exciting, which cherishes and celebrates humanity and nature. And so we began our practice straight from college, which was quite a roller coaster. And straight from the beginning, the idea of where our building materials came from, how those buildings were built, was a core part of the practice that we're involved in. And in 2003, we built our first mass timber building. We built a few more in the preceding years. And then in 2008, we had the opportunity to build a tall building, a building which could actually begin to think about, to talk about, to propose a different way of building high-density urban housing in low-carbon materials. And so in 2008, we built Murray Grove. It was a very simple building in many ways. In fact, in many ways, in all honesty, it was a concrete building. It is a concrete building made of timber. It probably has about twice as much timber in it as was needed. All the engineering calculations were done with a slide ruler and a calculator, and it was drawn by hand. And you can see, and it was put together really simply. So 3-inch galvanized angle brackets and 5-inch screws. But the whole building went together with 4 people in 27 days and was incredibly quiet, incredibly accurate and fast. We were able to reduce the foundations on site by 1/3. There's very little site waste because everything came prefabricated. And so this is a journey that we've continued on since that time. And we've now completed more than 30 buildings in the UK and France, and we have projects in the US and throughout Europe. And an important part of our practice has become that research, has become that sharing of knowledge into the work that we do, where we see opportunities for innovation, where we see opportunities for difference, but also where we see opportunities to encourage others to work in similar ways and to carry on those discussions. And so part of that is talking about how we can de-risk the process of building in timber. You know, we've been building the same way for 100 years. The concrete and the steel, that kind of fills all our lexicon of imagery as architects has to change. And in order to do that, we have to think really, really closely about how these buildings are built, because we need to reduce the risk. We need to reduce risk for ourselves. We need to reduce risk for the industry. So a couple of years ago, we started a project. 3 years ago, we started a project called the New Model Building, with the idea that we would actually present and propose a new way of building, a new way of thinking about architecture. And so the New Model Building works with insurers and engineers and contractors and foresters to have a competent and compliant, simple form of architecture for high-density urban housing. And this is for modest buildings. These are buildings under 18 meters. These are your 60 by 60 by 60 buildings. So these are sprinklered buildings. They have very low embodied carbon. They comply to all the current building regulations without question. They fulfill all the different criteria for insurance in the UK and for warranty and for housing and code guarantees. We put together a very simple kind of notion of this building, one with a sloping roof so that the water will drain if there's any failure in the waterproofing membrane. And every junction of this kind of generic building type is described in great detail. These 30 details, which are across the whole building, allow this kind of system of construction to be made in a very simple and straightforward way. Each of those details comes with a checklist. Each of the checklists for each of those details comes with 3 alternative materials that can be used for each junction, each detail. And then we put together, working with contractors, we put together diagrams of how those junctions, how those details can be made. Because one of the things that we found when we were trying to explain the buildings that we wanted to build was we had kind of put out these beautiful architectural plans in front of insurers or in front of code officials. And we realized that they didn't really understand what we were talking about. They didn't really know what these drawings meant. And this elaborate code that we're all used to presenting and proposing as architects, in fact, is something that is actually largely unintelligible by many other people, even within our own industry. So we started to think about the way that we drew, the way in which we transmitted the information that's so important to our practice. And so we put together a series of GIFs. I think you call them GIFs. You call them GIFs? So weird. Anyway, so we put together, and if you follow us on Instagram, we release one of these kind of every month or so. But the idea was that we put together a series of GIFs that can be understood. So we demystify, we declutter, we try and kind of break down this kind of elaborate nature of the architecture, which so many of our peers seem to be involved in. And constantly we refer back to the carbon burden of what we're looking at in construction. Now in the UK, it's pretty typical for a mid-rise housing block to be about 1,000 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per meter squared. And what we look to do is to reduce that. So by building in timber, we're able to take that down to 600. By including the biogenic carbon, the sequestered carbon within the timber itself, we're able to further reduce that so that we're looking at a 75% reduction in the amount of carbon that's used in one of these buildings. And then eventually, like water from a stone, we were able to get our letter of code pre-approval. So this is a letter from the UK government, which still doesn't allow us to build in timber, but actually now pre-approves that for code and for insurance and for mortgages in the UK. And we're now embarking on a series of different buildings using those details across the UK. And now hoping to take the New Model Building and to replicate that in Spain, in Italy, in France, and hopefully in the US. And we've taken that same model, that same way of thinking about construction, also into office buildings. So this is a building we completed a couple of years ago for Blackstone in central London. And this is another thing that we've always maintained, that the way in which we talk about our work, the people that we work for, is about being mainstream. That this is never a peripheral activity. This isn't something that we want to do on the edge of society. This is something that we want to do in the mainstream of construction and development. So Blackstone, massive organization who weren't really that interested that we were building in timber until the building was finished. And it was pre-let, 100% pre-let, and now lets for 40% more than they thought it would let. And so they put the building on the front cover of their annual report and said that Blackstone is a sustainable company. So the inside of this building is simple and clear. We use clear glazing without e-coatings on it, so you can recycle the glass. The structure is built to be completely reusable, and each one of the components in the building are easily demountable. And so this is an architecture which has a set of clear design principles. It celebrates its context. It celebrates the well-being of the people that use it. It's an architecture of sufficiency and efficiency. And its simple, reduced services mean that it's a sustainable architecture without compromise. And so we've written a book about that one as well. And this is the Commercial Timber Guidebook, which sets out a clear set of principles which can be followed and used by architects, by developers, by insurers, in terms of looking how they can build and what they can build in the commercial space. And this is the number of tree seeds that it took to grow the trees that built our first tall building. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, we have Tanya Rufi. Tanya is the Director of Engineering at Timber Lab. Timber Lab is a mass timber company that provides all sorts of expertise. So pre-construction, manufacturing, fabrication, installation, fills all of those knowledge gaps that we're lacking in a lot of other areas in the industry. And as a structural engineer, you have also made the shift from concrete and steel to mass timber, so we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Lindsay, to my fellow panelists, and especially to Alan. It's an honor to be here. So my perspective on mass timber is primarily as a structural engineer. So I spent the first almost 20 years of my career as a structural consultant, working for various design firms. And over the course of that time, I've also gotten involved a little bit in the work of developing building codes. So I'm really deep in the weeds every day on the structural and the code stuff. I joined Timber Lab about 1.5 years ago, so now I'm also learning to see this world from the perspective of a fabricator and a manufacturer. And so my knowledge there is not nearly as deep, but it's been very interesting for me to start building that knowledge, and the desire to do so is really what kind of catapulted me over that what often seems like a very tall, thick wall between designers and builders. So I want to start off talking about a few of the barriers that I see to innovation on both the design and the construction sides of the mass timber world. And an important piece of context is the fact that wood is one of our oldest building materials. So essentially wherever humans and forests have coincided, we have used trees to build things. And so you might think that that's an advantage, this long and deep history that we have with wood structures, but in the current moment, I actually think it's a pronounced disadvantage. Because over most of that span of time, right, we were not designing wood structures really based on science, unless you count trial and error. We got used to relying on this kind of tribal knowledge that was built up over time, rules of thumb, and then, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think the fact that this material feels so familiar to us, I think a lot of people who engineer wood buildings suffer from what psychologists sometimes call the illusion of explanatory depth, which really just means that there's a bias in which we think we understand things a lot better than we actually do. And my favorite example of this is if you ask most people if they know how a toilet works, they will say yes. But then if you really ask them, you tell them, draw me a diagram and explain to me exactly how a toilet works, Most of them can't, right, including me. And my entire journey so far in the design of wood buildings has been this process of discovering that I'm that person that doesn't know how the toilet works. I'm trying to draw the diagrams and I'm realizing, oh dear, okay. So you start asking questions, right? One of the most obvious ones when you're a structural engineer is, okay, we have these strength values that are in the code that tell us how to design a wood building. And where do those come from? And so if you go to the code and, there's tables in the code and you say, okay, I have a 2x4 made of Alaska cedar that's been visually graded as select structural. And so this table tells me to do all my design checks, assuming that I have a bending strength of 1150 PSI. Well, that's pretty specific. How did we get to that number? And that seems like an innocent question, but it's really like the magician's scarf. You start pulling and it just keeps coming. And the more you sort of dive into that, I don't have enough time to go into the details and I probably would bore you all to death if I did, but you dig into that simple question and you realize how many assumptions are baked into the way that we write the codes. Some of them are maybe a little questionable. A few of them are flat out wrong. And it just so happens that all these errors we're making, they appear to be canceling each other out in a way that is either somewhat close to the truth or conservative, because thankfully we don't see a lot of wood buildings falling down. But when I compare wood with steel and reinforced concrete, right, which I also had a lot of experience designing early in my career, those material codes feel entirely different. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we invented those materials in modern times. There were no rules of thumb to rely on. We had to start with a blank slate. And so I think the steel and concrete codes are actually much better because of that. So, we have some challenges with wood on the code side of things. I think we're in a moment that calls for change in how we design timber buildings, but we're up against these hundreds of years of kind of baked in ideas about how it's done. So it's not really quite so easy. And then if I hop over to the manufacturing side for a moment, and again, I'm not really the expert here. I'm kind of learning my way. But what I've observed now working for a manufacturer, and particularly as we plan, a brand new CLT manufacturing plant out in Oregon, here I think one of the main challenges is that our supply chain for mass timber, so the raw inputs come from the softwood lumber market, which in the United States is a commodity market and a huge market. And the vast majority of wood used in structures in the United States is this, right? It's dimension lumber, it's stick frame, single-family homes, low to mid-rise, multifamily residential. And the mass timber market is a barnacle on a whale. So, over the last decade or so, the United States and Canada have produced about 60 billion board feet of softwood lumber per year. If you prefer metric, that's about 140 million cubic meters. That's enough to fill the bowl of Wembley Stadium over 120 times. The amount of softwood lumber consumed in the North American mass timber market in 2023 was about 300 million board feet, or a little over 700,000 cubic meters. So you can't even fill one Wembley with that. And it's roughly the output capacity of a single modern North American sawmill. I tried to come up with another clever analogy, and because I'm a Jersey girl, I figured out that if the North American softwood lumber market were the drive from New York City to San Francisco, the mass timber market would get you to Newark Airport. And so what that means essentially is we have zero leverage, right? We are operating in an environment that is 100% optimized for light wood framing, right? It's it's the tyranny of the 2x4. So it's this, and it's really stark also when you work with European mass timber manufacturers, as we do sometimes, and often I'm just green with envy at what they're able to do. And I think, although there are lots of reasons for those differences, one of them is that I suspect they are not as hopelessly enslaved to the market for 2x as we are. It gives them a lot more flexibility. I think it makes it easier for them to innovate. And this primacy of dimension lumber and stick framing in the United States, I can tie that back to the point I was making earlier about codes, and I think really the steel people got this right. So the building on the left is made from cold formed steel studs. These are structures that typically top out around 8 to 10 stories. The building on the right is a high rise made in steel. These can easily reach 80 to 100 stories. Both of these buildings are made with steel, but they are governed by two different codes. Right? So why are these two different codes. There we go, sorry. So why are these two wood buildings governed by the same code? Yes, they're both wood, but that's pretty much where the similarities stop. And the American Wood Council, who writes the wood code, they seem headed down this path of they're still trying to have one code which addresses all of these new materials and methods that we're seeing pop up in the mass timber world, but they don't seem to want to rock the boat too much for the light frame folks. And so, in my opinion, that's a big problem and a challenge. And the last thing I want to mention, that I see as a very big challenge is the fact that we operate in a very segmented and siloed environment. I really appreciated the comments from Dean Bernstein this morning about the complexity of systems. And, I think often, so many of us are hyper specialists in some very narrow field or portion of a field, and it's hard to see the big picture. And so I think often of the parable of the blind men and the elephants, right? We're all touching different parts of this same system and coming to wildly different conclusions about what it is we're dealing with. And so without that broader perspective, it's much more difficult to innovate. I would argue that innovation is only useful if it's in service of something that improves things for everyone and not just one little slice of the world, my little slice of the world that I focus on. And, we live in a capitalist country, and so the ardent capitalist would say to that, well, you don't need a person or some central planning agency to take the broader view and act for the greater good. That's what the invisible hand of the markets does. And I think we are starting to reckon with the limits of that strategy. That's a whole other talk. But so, to close out, as Trevor Noah likes to say on his podcast, starts his conversation saying, okay, what now? So we're supposed to be here talking about solutions. I've been up here just mainly whinging about the problems. So if I'm going to pick up on what the ardent capitalists are putting down, markets can be very effective in spurring innovation, but they fail when the price of something doesn't reflect its true cost. And right now, we are not paying the true cost of carbon, the cost of pollution. So we need a carbon tax badly. We need it now. And believe me, I know how insanely improbable that sounds in our current state of affairs. But remember, this also doesn't have to be a federal carbon tax. Cities and states can and should, in my opinion, tax embodied carbon in construction projects. I think that one change could single-handedly alter the entire face of the building industry. On a related note to that, how do we incentivize what some people are calling Goldilocks density, right? Density, but in that low to mid-rise range. I think one of my favorite factoids that I say a lot is, if we housed everyone at a density similar to Paris, right, which is not full of high rises, but neighborhoods of buildings that are often 3-4 stories tall, we could fit 11 billion people into an area the size of France. And so this type of density has the lowest carbon footprint. It lends itself perfectly to mass timber construction. And I think if we were hyper-focused on building at this density, I think you'd see a lot more players willing to enter this market and take the risks that are needed to spur innovation. So we need people, kind of dedicated to the very unsexy but hugely important work of changing zoning laws if this is going to happen. And finally, on the engineering and code side of things, I think we need we need to find a way to see this old material with new eyes. We need stronger and better collaboration among academics, industry, policymakers, and especially our wood code. When new code provisions are developed without input from practicing architects and engineers and builders, as they currently sometimes are, not only do we fail to encourage innovation, we actually stifle it. And so, maybe we need an entirely new wood code for mass timber that leaves the stick frame stuff alone and strikes out on its own. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Tanya. And last but not least, Keel Mo, architect, author, building forest ecologist, and a new book coming out that y'all should stay tuned for.
Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, any coherent conversation about regenerative design must first fully acknowledge that our present pedagogies, practices, and policies related to building remain inexplicably organized around an unrepentant take, make, fake, and break paradigm that takes land and resources to make products and assemble buildings. It then construes data to promote purported environmental virtue and putative sustainability, and it demolishes any building that stands in the way of another cycle of this paradigm's planned obsolescence. This paradigm is inherently extractive, and it is driven by what ecological economics calls a receiver theory of value. This approach will never be regenerative because its externalities, metabolic rifts, unequal exchanges, and environmental load displacements abound in this top-down mode of value. Based as it is on a receiver theories of forests and buildings, the timber industry historically, and the mass timber industry presently, reproduces many aspects of this take, make, fake, break paradigm through its genre of extraction, centralized capital, errant carbon accounting, and how it breaks not just old buildings, but rural places and people as well. I cannot find a way to construe CLT in particular as a regenerative proposition, given the history, present conditions, and future trajectories of Northeast forests. Today's secondary forests are ecologically and socially unlike old forests and exhibit dramatic changes in species composition, fire ecology, soil conditions, and land use. Present secondary forests are much younger and much more homogeneous than old growth forests. And that degraded forest is now once again in decline on account of the financialization of northern stands, biomass fuel extraction, and increased ex-urban development. All this leads to degraded, understocked forests in key portions of the Northeast and overstocked stands in most other parts. Further straining that manifold degradation, the Northeast continues to consume more timber than it produces, with an emphasis on low-quality, very short-life pulp and pellet products and lumber imports. If we intend a mode of regenerative design that actually regenerates environmental and social conditions through design rather than further degrades them, that is, if we for once actually wish to do good rather than merely appear less bad, then at some point we must finally enact a contrasting theory of value, known in ecological economics as a donor theory of value, which puts the geophysical work of the planet and human labor first as the source of real growth and wealth. To that end, in my work, I place the forest first in my thinking about the terrestrial ecology of timber building. To best do so, several years ago, I moved away from tenured professorships to a rural forest in Vermont, completed a degree in forest ecology to augment my research on construction ecology, and reoriented my decades of timber design and building practices around land-based approaches. It was no longer adequate for me to talk about timber and forests in the abstract. I needed to change my situation and speed, because forests operate at a vastly different pace than academic semesters, grant cycles, and construction schedules. Rather than taking and making, I needed to learn how to properly tend and mend forest conditions as a pretext for minding forest building relations. In that regard, I often wonder if my forest building ecology is, in fact, regenerative. Today, I briefly offer you 6 criteria in this regard. First, the biological life of eastern hemlock can be several hundred years, and its ecological life extends beyond that. By contrast, a typical North American building lasts 65 years, while straw and hemp have an annual regeneration cycle. Basic arithmetic establishes that only if your building cycle is longer than your regen cycle, then is it mathematically possible that your project could be regenerative. Second, we really should be more candid with ourselves and the public. Buildings are not long-term carbon sinks. In the Northeast, 100 years after a timber harvest, only about 6 to 7% of harvested carbon is still in use. In the Southeast, that figure is down around 3%. Accordingly, the current functional unit of analysis in timber building carbon assessment, which is based on static accounts of stored carbon per cubic component volume, is errant and reflects an extractive receiver-based valuation of carbon. Only a land-based dynamic assessment of forest building carbon dynamics, which assesses building carbon per forest area, reflects a donor theory of value. Here, the compound role of present and future carbon dynamics, both in the forest and in the building, are assessed and together tell us something temporally and spatially meaningful about forest building carbon relations. Very much related, any prospect of regenerative design must begin and end with soil prescriptions. By far the most important and stable carbon sink in the Northeast is below ground. To this end, the soil history of the Northeast forest generally, as well as stand-by-stand soil knowledge, is essential to any prospect of regenerative forest building prescriptions. Fourth, though generally absent in discussions about timber building, specific gravity serves as a succinct indicator of the relationship between forest quality, timber quality, and thus the potential for building quality. The prioritization of short rotation, high intensity monospecies harvest in present mass timber discourse is troubling in this regard, as it again reflects a receiver theory of value and thus proves extractive as a prescription. In global climate models, specific gravity is used to gauge net primary production in forests. It also reveals much about how timber strength and durability correlate to forest prescriptions. A higher specific gravity specimen within any species is a sound indicator of higher quality forest practices, higher quality timber, and higher quality building products and assemblies. Fifth, a regenerative forest building prescription, especially in the context of changing climates and forests, would need to overtly relate and match forest functional traits with timber building functional traits. This has been one focus of Peter Osborne's dissertation at McGill, which was advised by Christian Messier, Michael Gemtrude, and I. Like Northeast stands, the boreal forest does not support the short rotation, high intensity monospecies forests of mass timber given the species composition change in the decades ahead. A much more diverse mix of species and corresponding mix of building components should guide policy and economic planning in the timber building industry, and it ought to directly inflect what kind of buildings architects should design. A sixth, more general criteria considers the cultivation of old growth attributes in the Northeast. In this regard, one technique developed in the Northeast is structural complexity enhancement, which uses mechanical treatments to mimic old growth attributes. This entails a 57% reduction in harvested timber product, and in preferred future forest futures, more biomass needs to remain in the forest to rehabilitate these stands. But we do not see such techniques in current practice. We instead see high grading, clear cuts, and ad hoc harvesting in many areas. In short, regional silviculture is off track, as is regional land use. Harvesting and land use change together result in growing fragmentation, which opens ever more patch edges to the reach and range of introduced disturbance-adapted species, what many call invasive, that rapidly occupy growing space, absorb available light and water, and thereby snuff out forest succession, resulting in vinescapes that actively pull down stands and rapidly yield totalizing ground cover. Such species are primarily found along corridor edges like roads and utility corridors and extend into forest stands up to 1,000 meters, amounting to some 20% of the Northeast forest area along paved areas alone. So to rehabilitate current forest conditions, there should be a dramatic reduction in harvesting, and that harvesting that does occur through single tree and small group selection would need to occur in carefully selected areas far away from patch edges. This is hardly a moment to call for a dramatic increase in harvesting, especially for the single species, short rotation, high volume lamb stock for CLT. I'm curious how promoters of mass timber construe CLT as regenerative in this context. I hope we can avoid a situation wherein the prospects of actual regenerative design are not greenwashed once again within the take, make, fake, and break paradigm. CLT does not and cannot serve to regenerate northeastern forests. Thus, in the decades ahead, how might we think about not just finite forest resources, but the specificity of their evolving species, conditions, ages, and forest futures? Our best hope for rehabilitating Northeast forests is to rehabilitate extant buildings in the Northeast. In other words, rehab is for quitters. Rehab is work for citizen designers who quit the slow and not so slow violence of the take and make paradigm, and instead aim to reconcile current forest conditions and building conditions through a land-based forest ecology that inverts numerous industry assumptions about forests, harvests, carbon, building, and the rurality of forest building systems. As a matter of resource justice and as a gush of goodwill, our best hope for regenerative design is to quit taking and making and finally embrace the exuberance and reciprocal metabolic gifts of rehabbing the forest building ecology together as a single, continuous, and concerted effort. Thank you.
I want to remind our audience that if you have a question, please scan the QR code and I'll see it here on the iPad. So thank you so much to our speakers today for trying to fit the world into 10 minutes. I mean, I think that's the trend for everyone today. There's so much at stake and there's so much on the table and there's constantly so much value to be debated, I believe, especially, with our 4 speakers here. I wanted to, tie together the presentations through this idea of interpreted value and risk and the definition of where we're trying to go. Because I think that, Andrew, you brought up this great point about, why endeavor in this way? Why build a manual? It's because this idea that architecture in the built environment is to improve someone's health. This idea that measuring health is not yet a way that we economically value the built environment. Those two things aren't linked. We don't understand the economic impact of carbon emissions with regards to health when it comes to the built environment. And that might be something that you've also talked about, Mark, where the investment in nature, the implication is that we will not kill ourselves and therefore remain healthy or become healthier society, not only in body but also mind. Mm-hmm. And so and the definition that you brought up, Keel, about reading Northeast Forests or as you might put it, listening to Northeast Forests, putting yourself in the position to listen to them more intimately, and then you representing the Northeast Forest saying, this is not what the Northeast Forest wants. I think it's really interesting to have this discussion about who gets to say what a healthy forest looks like, especially when you look at pre-colonial forest makeup, the idea of biodiversity, and the link to markets. And what we know is that putting money in a forest keeps it healthy because a poor forest will burn. We know that. But that means that that market, the products that we like, and like the color of, very superficial things, the aesthetic of, that's going to change nature. That's going to change the nature of the forest. So that seems to be at odds. Who gets to say what forests we're heading towards and what kind of regenerative material we use? We don't want to go backwards to a kind of pure idea of pure nature. I think that's also damaging. So maybe we can all share some thoughts on who gets to decide in this and at what scale. Is it a single person in the woods, or is it a global economy, this massive, or a bank? Who gets to decide? How might you define?
Hopefully not banks.
Maybe we hear from you, Mark. How are those conversations unfolding in the rooms that you're in?
Well, you ask a very complex question, and I think at the end we will need to find compromises, Obviously, we need to look at which are the alternatives that we have. We have, by the way, a lot of degraded land in the world, hundreds of millions of hectares that we could restore, plant trees, And I think you can find compromises, and science can provide the guidance to do that. You can find compromises where you are having a productive forest that is biodiversity rich. But again, here we need to change the approach that we have been using in forestry from a rather extractive, in many cases, to a regenerative one, to follow ecological principles. To me, an ideal silviculture, in a way, is one that mimics as much as possible natural disturbances, because forests are dynamic systems. So basically, if we can have a forestry that is mimicking as much as possible natural disturbances, still you can utilize timber. But I think one thing that we didn't discuss that we need to put on the table, and it's not very popular, is our addiction to consumption. Because we have not only doubled the population in the last 50 years, more or less double, but we have doubled the per capita consumption of materials. And this is an amazing problem. We are in 50 years double the population, but we are using more than triple the materials that we were using 50 years ago, especially because we have tripled the people living in the cities in those 50 years. So I think we will always end up and this is why a circular approach is very important, because one of the things we need to do is to start decreasing our consumption per capita. Especially, if countries, the so-called global south countries, are mirroring themselves in us, in the US especially, the per capita consumption here is huge, in Europe too. And I think this is something that needs to be tackled. Otherwise, we can be talking about silviculture, about many things, but we will be using, again, an approach that is not feasible, because biological resources are renewable, but they are not unlimited. And we need to understand what is the rate of change in a biological system. So coming back to your question, very challenging one, but don't ask banks for an answer. I think banks, and this is why I decided to join a bank. I am a scientist, 25 years in science, but I was very frustrated after 25 years leading institutes like the European Forest Institute, because you see how many solutions we have, but they are not implemented in the private sector, in the finance sector. So I think if we want a system level change, which is going to be challenging, banks need to have scientists inside. Private sector across different industries need to have scientists. But to do that, I think universities also need to prepare people to be able to engage with those industries. And the problem, I think, who mentioned that now we have more and more people knowing more and more about less and less. And this is not the way, it's exactly the opposite what we need. We need at least a few people knowing more and more about more and more to connect the dots, you know?
I mean, a couple of thoughts that come to mind, and then I'd love to hear just what are the conversations that you've been involved in too, Andrew. All of the stakeholders that are at the table when you're talking about a manual and being able to scale these details for an entire country at once. When you're talking about forestry that mimics natural systems, a couple of the ideas that might come up, as we move down the panel is the idea of cool burning or bringing back indigenous techniques of understanding the forest, responding to it, which are really difficult to optimize. So our idea of telling stories that can, or at least creating roadmaps for different places on the planet, becomes really a big challenge with wood because it can't scale like a dead, durable, transportable material like steel and cement. So there's this interpretive dance that is required. How are you experiencing that kind of interpretation across this massive scale that you're involved in now?
I mean, these are constant questions that, questions that we ask ourselves in practice as well. I think that it's also really important to weigh up what the alternative practices will be, and to think about, in many ways, which is the least bad. We don't look at, somebody showed a slide before about the degradation caused by sand extraction, the environmental degradation caused by open cast mining. The mere existence of humans on the planet, degrades our environment. This is true. But I think, and we need to improve our practices. We need to improve the way that we do many things in society globally. But certainly, I think that to use bio-based materials rather than extractive materials is the only viable alternative. We need to do that in a way which works with our forests, but these are also crops. These are crops for humanity to utilize in the best way that they can. So I think we need to be pragmatic about it. It's not the most romantic of answers.
Well, I think it's exactly, that's kind of the challenge too. Some of these ideas about responding and being adaptive in the moment or understanding a particular landscape, it's not as sexy as doing big shiny buildings, saying we did the tallest thing. And I think that's where storytelling, aesthetics, a lot of our tools as architects are very critical, really important representation for changing the narrative and for, putting huge text on the screen with big blue background, changing the way that we might see this story. So I want to hear from you, Tanya. How are these conversations happening and unfolding when you're questioning the very nature of any kind of code? I can't imagine a client comes to you and says, we need you to help us engineer a building, and you say, let's just take a step back and question the tables that we already do actually have. How do you balance those two things maybe in your practice, and how does one move at different speeds? How can you describe that?
Yeah, it's always this constant, you have to move forward with what you've got now. You realize it's imperfect. You're always trying to figure out how do you change. It seems like this big, opaque, difficult to move system. You think, I'm one person, how do how do I change it? So you think a lot about that. But I really appreciate, pick up on what Mark was saying about a lot of it is just here. So much of this is about mindset and I think you do have opportunities to help people, even if it's slight, change the mindset. I'll use the example of, even when people have good intentions, this idea of sustainable forestry and, how are we, where is my wood coming from? And there is still this very superficial mentality, I think, in the community about we'll just specify FSC certified wood and we're good. And we're going to move on with life, And the real picture, of course, is so much more complex than that. And although certification is an important tool that is available, there's so much more to it. And I think, we try to, especially as we have now become in the last year, right? We acquired a glulam manufacturing plant, so now we're a manufacturer. We're building this CLT plant. We are having a lot of conversations about what does it mean? How do we, what kind of certifications are we going to have? But beyond that, what does it mean? Where are we going to source from? And I think we're always trying to, on projects with our clients, especially when we're involved early, is try to have that conversation go a little deeper than just what certification program are you going to tick on your lead form. So.
Exactly. Yes, I agree. I think it's an interesting point, and it'll connect, I think, to a lot of the questions folks have for Kiel. This idea of what's ethical, and for those of you, maybe there's only one person in the room that doesn't know what FSC is, but certification of wood has this dimension of ethical and economic sides to it, and if you don't certify it or you don't prove where it's sourced from, somehow that has a different value in the market, right? And you can put stamps on things, people can forge stamps for things and charge a certain amount for wood, and it distorts a lot of what would have been a really, earnest approach to labor laws, labor practices, sustainable harvesting, particular ways that we interpret the forest. So that is one of the challenges with scaling ideas about what it means to have a good forest beyond a kind of territorial boundary. And I think, Kiel, you got to this manifesto level with your presentation, and I think a lot of folks are wondering, a handful here, 4 questions are about whether you like wood, or if you want us to use wood, or if the idea is to have all construction stop entirely. And I think, whether, I'm curious to hear your opinion, but I also think that it's something that's being talked about in schools and in the industry, especially in Europe, this question of how much should we build? Should we be teaching folks to build from the ground up? Is that an ethical thing to do?
Yeah, I'll try to hit any number of the 6 questions there. Yes, I like wood even more. I like forests and what they provide us, biodiversity, all kinds of things. I think we're unbelievably timber-centric and city-centric in this conversation so far. There's lots of things to unpack there. Yes, I like wood so much that I can't tell you to build in CLT. Right, there's just so many other ways. We need a totally different interpretation of what growth is in this particular context. We need a different interpretation of the sun, as Mark was suggesting. There's a whole bunch of things that I think do scale radically and very quickly if we take them on in an earnest way. But just kind of blindly saying we're specifying CLT from an FSC forest isn't addressing any of the core issues. Again, it's just reproducing any number of forms of extraction. And so it's just a simple substitution, and there's lots of problems inherent in that. Is it less bad than some of the other options? Yes, but doing less bad is not to be confused with doing good. If you kick an animal 6 times a day rather than 12, doesn't mean you're a good person, right? You're still doing damage. And we're still doing damage in our building industry. We're still training architects in schools every day the art and science of extraction. And that stuff has to stop just immediately if we want to look each other in the eye and have these conversations. So yes, I love wood, but to such a degree that I can't promote it in some of the ways that my colleagues that I greatly respect maybe do and are.
But Kiel, are you against CLT or about the way it's being produced in some parts of the world? Because these are 2 different things.
Absolutely. No, CLT makes sense in certain regional forests in the Northeast. I don't think it has any sort of place. I don't know why you would centralize that much capital in one part of the forest that's already completely understocked, that can't reproduce itself already, and then ask for higher, intensity harvests at that point. In the Southeast, there's a place for CLT. There's already a plant there. There's a lot of basically loblolly that we need to clear out. It's junk wood. But that has to be a part of a regional strategy about how you replace all of that loblolly plantation with a real longleaf ecology that actually does some good, actually stores way more carbon, does all kinds of things. In Colorado, it's a totally different proposition. Colorado imports 90% of its timber. And there's no way with that mountainous geography that you're going to get to a CLT plant that makes sense. That's going to cost out for forest operations and trucking. We need, small diameter harvest out there, so totally different product streams. Northeast Colorado, I think a lot of this low quality timber that we have should be going into wood fiber insulation. It solves a cascade of issues, and that's why I would say we need to emphasize renovating, rehabilitating existing buildings with the simultaneous rehabilitation of those forests. So everything doesn't scale. There are some things that are absolutely unique about a single stand where I'm at in Vermont that are unique to the Northeast, that are totally different than across the river and the boreal forest, that are totally different than the history of forestry in Northern Europe. Like, these are all highly specific conditions that we have to acknowledge. Otherwise, we'll continue to treat them as extractive zones.
I think it's very important to acknowledge that, because it's clear that we are not going to have a single solution. And it's clear that certain forests need to focus on certain functions. We also need to use wood for the highest possible value. Nowadays, still globally, we are using 50% of the wood that we harvest globally, about 2 billion cubic meters of wood, is used for low efficient energy, which doesn't create much value. Of course, for the people using it in the global south, it's very important, but if we could displace, for example, that with other types of renewable energy, and you have the right technology and skills, you could have, for example, in Africa, we make some calculations that is actually every year in Africa, it's about 800 million cubic meters is used for low efficient energy. If you would just use half of that for wood engineering products, you could build around 5 million houses. And there is a huge deficit. So it's about using wood in certain areas for the right purpose, the right forest also, using certain forests in the right way. And I agree with you that certain forests should be used for biodiversity or for other reasons. But at the end of the day, don't forget that we have 50-60% of our habitable land is used for agriculture. And we can also rethink the way this 50-60% of the land is being used. Using agroforestry systems, you would have a combination of both. Carbon sinks, growing trees to produce CLT. So I think we should not narrow out blaming CLT, or it's about having the right picture and seeing, okay, how do we combine all the solutions? And again, we need to reduce consumption and we need to rehabilitate. And so it's an integrated approach.
Yeah, I appreciate this way of thinking from the forest towards the city. And I think that there's another approach to this future that we all really want to see, is from the city towards the forest, right? So we're reaching in both directions. And I think that this idea of developing code, it's a huge hurdle. It's always been talked about as a hurdle. You go to these conferences and it's like panels and panels about code as a hurdle. And we heard earlier that policy is this switch that has this potential to really create change. So when we're thinking about code, some of the things that come to my mind are the massive amounts of people that have to learn a bunch of new knowledge, switch from concrete and steel code to mass timber code. And how do you mobilize that, onboard that amount of people? That's a huge lift, and that's the promise of the manual and being involved, and all of you being involved in those rooms and in IPCC, and just having the practice of architecture be so much more expanded. So I wanted to take our last few minutes here and hear from Andrew and Tanya about an expanded mode of practice and how you're operating in those worlds in the mainstream where there's this really different sense of conservative values, or not from different folks at the table? And how are you moving the needle as you are operating as an architect that builds consensus as opposed to a kind of lone wolf person? I think that art and architecture are really different in that case. And architecture, you have to bring everybody along. And in this case, you're expanding the group. You're saying not only are we going to bring these 25 people along that are typically on the client side, but we're going to include 100 people at the building department. So how does that feel? Where do you see it going? And where might you encourage the students in the room to get involved? So maybe I'll ask Tanya to start, and then we can end with Andrew.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am encouraged at what I see happening kind of at the university level. I mean, I think there's a lot of promise. I always think it's the young people are going to have to save us. I feel like architecture is doing a better job of this so far than engineering. But engineering is kind of following on the heels of in a lot of places. I mean, when I went to engineering school at the University of Texas at Austin, and I loved it there. I think maybe there was one wood class that was an optional elective. And a lot of places don't have anything. You're slowly starting to see that change, and I think that's a huge part. That's a very important part of it. I think if our education system is not even talking to people about designing with wood, then we're always going to have an uphill battle. And then I think in terms of kind of once people are out in practice, I mean, the nice thing is I do feel like so now that I am an engineer working for a contractor, right? Like I spend a lot of time partnering up with other engineers because they're the engineer of record and we're designing the timber part, and a lot of it is just trying to, share with people what we know, introduce them to this wonderful, quirky world of designing buildings out of wood. There's things about it that are very different than the steel and concrete that you're used to,
Like specific gravity? Water.
Yeah, well, it's a natural material, right? It's not, you get used to steel and concrete and there's some ASTM standard that tells you, okay, I know that this piece of steel is going to behave exactly in this way, right? And wood is obviously not like that at all, which is why we have all these assumptions in the code to try to get us to something, because you have to assume something, right? You gotta go somewhere. So I don't know, it's sort of rambling a little bit, but I think it's a combination of, just getting more, getting better, sort of getting this on the radar in engineering schools, and then there's always kind of ongoing professional development that needs to happen, code stuff. I mean, there's lots of places where you can decide what's interesting to you. Like I said, I've sort of found myself in this code world. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, sometimes it is so dry you wanna poke your eyes out, but it's so important. Like you realize, you know what I mean?
It's so important.
Oh gosh, sometimes this is so boring, but it matters. Like you realize when you see, stuff that makes its way into the code and you're like, how did this get here? This is a problem.
Well, because only 5 to 7% of buildings involve architects at all. So even, and then that's imagine the low percent of architects that are thoughtfully sourcing, material, or like have the time or the fee to do it. Right. So I think that you're talking about the code having this scalar effect across the construction industry where there might not be someone, having this idea of making a change where that's more prescriptive, right, as opposed to
I mean, we rely so heavily on prescriptive codes, especially in the US, right? People, just to be frank about it, because having been a design consultant for so many years, we don't get paid enough to, it's a lot of effort. You can prove that you're gonna do something that's not in the prescriptive code that is even better than what's in the prescriptive code. That takes a lot of time and money and effort, and we're generally just not, I've always felt we've had trouble kind of sometimes explaining that value to clients who just want a building. Like we're not always, and I'm saying we engineers, I think especially, are not great at communicating that.
But now we have Andrew's manual.
Right.
So I mean,
that's what's so brilliant
I wanted
about it,
to
right?
wrap on this because even just this one detail that you went over really quickly was this idea that materials can be exchanged, that you have a code within a code where you could say, this mineral wool insulation can be exchanged for wood insulation or, other types of hemp insulation, denim insulation. And that kind of thinking does require so much research up front. And the big question, I bet, Keel, you have all kinds of ideas about like how AI would change this ability to scale that kind of knowledge. But I'm curious, first of all, quickly, where is this manual going? When can we have it in the US?
Well, you can have the UK one right now. So it's available online for free. I should have said that to be straight away. Yeah, so it's it's complete. All the research work that we do, we publish for free online. As a practice, that's been a kind of a core part of our practice for many years. I think, to Keel's point, the first point in thinking about how we proceed as architects has to be about building less. Building as little as possible. We use a wood use index in the practice, which is part of the new model building, where we track the amount of timber that we use, the cubic meters of timber that we use per square meter. And the practice ambition is that every project that we do has to use less timber per square meter than the project that we did before. So that's a kind of goal that we set ourselves as a practice, constantly to use as little timber in the buildings that we build as we possibly can. I think if that this is a paradigm shift, from the architecture of the 20th century, an extractive architecture based on kind of glamour and desire and kind of, toward one which is about responsibility and about an understanding of a relationship with our planet. And that part of that paradigm shift, the kind of more granular part of that paradigm shift, is an understanding of how we build with a different material, all the way down to the code. And I think it's essential that it's architects and engineers who are at the center of changing that code and not lobbyists. Because otherwise we're just going to end up with a lot more tall, shiny buildings just with a slightly more beige hue, which would be a disaster.
On that note, I wanted to open it up. I don't think I got to, as there's so many great questions here, and I don't know if we have time. Oh, okay, great. So Mark, let's say I'm going to pose one of these questions to you. This is from Mr. Yang, pardon me. With last year being the first time our global biosystems released more carbon than it absorbed, what can we do with this heightened risk to stabilize and return nature to its previous role at the breakneck pace needed to counter this? Can you explain what's happening in that case? And what practical and radical levers in society do you think are effective to halt this phenomenon?
Well, we could speak for hours.
Yeah,
but no,
look, course, yes.
Connecting with what Andrew just said, this paradigm shift in architecture engineering needs to be followed by a paradigm shift in the way we manage our landscapes. It's as simple as that. And now the challenge we are seeing is that much of the vegetation we have in the world is not adapted to the climate conditions, because climate change is changing faster than many forest ecosystems are adapting to that. This is why we see the wildfires, pest and disease, and partly this is how we have been managing those landscapes, too many monocultures, etc. So we need a paradigm shift, and needs to be an integrated approach. You need to combine how you manage your landscapes for food, for materials, for biodiversity, and require a paradigm shift. And it's obviously science, here.
I mean, I would love to ask, there's people writing, would love to ask my question.
If I can complement
there is still time. Type it in and I will read it.
And this is the importance, because at the end the problem we have in many parts of the world is that we will need to attract investments to enhance resilience, biodiversity, and manage properly these landscapes. So we need to connect that with the economy. So we will not be able to help nature, because that requires investments, requires actions, unless this is why the circular bioeconomy, I said that it's powered by nature, prospers in harmony with nature. For 200 years we have built this dichotomy between economy and ecology, nature and society, rural and urban, and this doesn't work. So we need to start connecting the dots.
I'm curious, so I want to hear from you, Keel, while I wait for a few people to write in their questions that they want to say into a mic. about economy and the link between the forest. So there's a story in my book about the role that OSB played in changing the face of forests across the earth. So prior to the OSB, you have to type it in, sorry. The prior to OSB, the invention of OSB, someone had to really invent this product that we, love, called OSB, and they determined, which trees were meant for that product. They determined this aesthetic through the use of particular species, its performative qualities through sheathing. And as soon as that came on the market, it incentivized the cultivation of aspen trees across the planet into the most cultivated species on the planet. So the link between aesthetics, markets, and economy and forests are so intertwined. And I'm curious, how are you seeing that? How are you projecting? You're so in tune with the Northeast forest, knowing that CLT is not the answer. What is the answer? Is that where you're headed with that argument?
Well, from a kind of maybe the economics, as we would typically think about it, what I'm thinking about and working on is absolutely a regional proposition, economic proposition. What kind of facilities should we be building? How many jobs are there? Again, identifying CLT factory, which is incredibly high fixed capital, is very low resiliency, not nimble, can't change to changing forest conditions, species, et cetera. Only a very few jobs, and all of that wealth absolutely has to leave the region because the economics, the capital paying for that factory came from somewhere else. So we need a much more decentralized strategy that's producing different. I love glulam's. I think you can do so much with glulam's. Different species. It's much more easy to engineer a mixed species glulam. There's lots of amazing things about that. Certain small scales of DLT panels or that sort of thing, people with a garage can make a bunch of that stuff. And I think learning how to scale those products and to different parts of the Northeast, all of that's part of a climate strategy, an economic strategy, a building strategy. But architects need to know which products what kind of buildings should we be designing? A CLT building in the Northeast is not part of that prescription. So we need to design different techniques for that region. And I think that's an amazing thing. That's what we love about vernacular architecture from all over the world, is those kinds of connections, those kinds of feedbacks and reinforcements of any ecological system. So I think that's the kind of design that I'm in. I'm both designing a small smoke sauna because that's the only non-extractive building you can build in the Northeast, but I'm also simultaneously thinking about the economics and forestry of the whole Northeast at the same time. We can do both. We don't need to pigeonhole anybody into a single scale or a single practice. We need all of this stuff, and we need people who are making the connections and the handshakes between these other disciplines that have not talked to each other for a century.
Absolutely. I think a lot about the importance of that last thing that you said is pluralism in this space, and the importance of variety, not only a variety of species, but a variety of approaches, and that being interested in already challenging the status quo is a really great step. There's a question, I'm going to read both of the questions, because I want to make sure that we get both of them out. One is directed to everyone, and the other one is directed to Mark, but I believe everyone can definitely chime in. So it seems there's a lot of conversation about what material we build with and what energy we use, but not about how we live. If we need to perform the fastest and most dramatic economic and energetic transition in history, then why isn't some form of collapse the more likely way forward? Or might I add degrowth, a strategized degrowth? Are we culturally ready for degrowth, or in this case of the question, collapse? Why, if the forest and nature are our fundamental infrastructure and our best insurance, and the world from which we emerged, do we see all of these visions of the city as fundamentally unchanged, just a city made of wood? And then the second question, I think, complements it very well. How will the economic shift be possible, given that there's so much money involved and politics involved behind that money in extractive and destructive industries? And one thought, just to put forward for my own research, is our lack of multi-generational thinking. When we think about mindsets, the planning that happens in our current culture, if I might blanket that around the global north, is not necessarily a multi-generational way of thinking. So how? And then I guess I also want to highlight the way that we live, how do we resist consumption? Apologies, I might add one more thing. The Jevons paradox. Efficiency doesn't beget less consumption, right? Yeah, efficiency equals more consumption.
This is why cities are so good and so bad, because they are so efficient that they accelerate consumption. Look, at the end of the day, we need to rethink our economy. The way we measure the success of our economy with GDP. One of what was Bobby Kennedy that says GDP measures everything except what it matters. So this tells you everything. And someone was talking about the invisible hand, was you? The invisible hand is so invisible that no one has seen that invisible hand, because all the market failures that our economy has created, the invisible hand doesn't correct us. What we are having now is a very visible slap from climate change, So basically, economists need to do a good job because they have brought us here. My wife is an economist. So, the way we have been teaching economics also needs to change fundamentally because it brought us to this vicious cycle. So again, I don't want to be pessimistic, but we are in a moment that we need to rethink ourselves, basically. And why nature is our only insurance? Because at the end of the day, you see how nature functions, and the engine of nature is biodiversity. Biodiversity is the insurance of life to change, And basically, the only way we have now to build resilience across our supply chains is by investing in biodiversity. This is our insurance. Yeah, so it's really fundamental questions, but I don't know how to answer. You would need here, people from many different disciplines, and of course, we need regulations at the end of the day, because how do you address this addiction to consumption? It's going to be very challenging, and I am really critical about artificial intelligence and this digital economy, because at the end of the day, in the Western world, we are very good at creating technology solutions to solve problems that we are creating ourselves. So we are very bad in translating science into wisdom. Indigenous people are very good at that. They are capable of translating knowledge into wisdom. We are extremely bad. So as you said, a lot of digital technology to do what? It's a bit of, this is why we need this mindset shift. It's about being wise enough. We have so much knowledge, so much technology, for what? So how do we become wiser?
Yeah, to this point about indigenous knowledge, about multi-generational thinking, and your first question about who has a voice, Lindsay, the Northeast did have a regenerative economy for 12,000 years. The Benaki, they had it completely dialed in. It made total sense. And within the space of 80 years, we had 90% genocide with that group. That knowledge is gone. I interact with the Benaki in my area quite a bit. They're there, but the state of Vermont won't even recognize them, much less a building industry that's trying to learn how to have a regenerative economy. But they know a lot of things that we don't know, that we would benefit greatly from, but they're not here.
Yeah, that's true.
They're always not at the table. And we need to, we won't get to those next levels unless we, learn how to include some of these other voices. This is a very, kind of ecological modernization, techno-positivist conversation so far. It's not the only way forward. It's created as many problems as it's resolved, that kind of mindset. So we need to listen to other voices. We need to see with other eyes, other experiences. We don't value them right now. But that's part of the path forward, absolutely, I think. Yeah.
And they would not like a place like this, to be honest. We should meet them in the forest.
Concrete basement, talking about wood, yeah.
I think I think you're absolutely, spot on in saying that there are so many voices that are underrepresented in this space. A lot of the certifications like FSC, SFI, are born out of a text that was written inside Weyerhaeuser, for example, inside a company that is trying to optimize the woods for a singular product. So questioning who's writing the ethical dimensions that we're playing the game by. Like you're saying, Tanya, that's your first step when you went into wood. Wait a minute, who's deciding this? So it seems like all of you share that passion for inefficiency in your work. And dedication to a kind of unoptimized process. And I think that's important because you're more spending time listening. And I keep thinking about the manual for construction and how it might change and the scale at which those material flows would be according to potentially the Waugh-Thistleton rule of ethics, like good or bad or something like this. If someone replaces a material, does it now adhere to the kind of standards that you've set? Is that something that you're thinking about or concerned with, or is that maybe the boundary that you might draw?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely it is. And I think that, the provenance of the materials that we use, thinking about where the things that we consume come from, who made them, what the implications of extracting those things are, whether or not they're replenishable, that's a really important dimension which we need to add to the way that we think about buildings, the way that we think about architecture. And that's something that we talk about a lot as a practice. What we're trying to find is a solution that's immediate, that's something that we can work with right now. What we're not proposing is that the solutions that we have made are ultimately the best solutions for the future, for the entire future. But, this is a climate crisis, and a crisis requires immediate action, immediate paradigm shift, immediate change. And for that to evolve into something better is what we should all be hoping towards, looking towards, working towards. But certainly we need to change the here and now. And if we wait for better things to come along before we change, if we're going to wait for green concrete or wait for green steel or wait for hydrogen to somehow, then we're just going to still be waiting, hand-wringing, in decades to come.
No.
Okay, you've been raising your hand the whole time. Can you yell loud enough? Okay, this is an unrecorded question. I'll repeat it.
We talked a lot about cities throughout the whole session so far, but when it comes to the building for cities, which is higher density, requires a whole series of requirements that are not required for more traditional building types. We've created a global phenomenon. Everyone wants it, right? Urbanization on the globe is one of the major topics. Everyone wants to live in a city now, and that comes with all of these requirements, right? And cities themselves are machines of disassociating themselves with the source of their materials. They just do that naturally. They have this reach. So the questions of where are fibers coming from and how we use that fiber is a technical question in terms of your specific density, et cetera. Can we use more of the tree more efficiently, et cetera? And is that going to work to serve the needs of the urban built environment? But putting those two things together seems to me almost a little bit of a missing piece here. And mass timber has sort of done that in a maybe clumsy way, and maybe not a particularly efficient way, but we can build an urban building out of wood. Are we talking, Keel, I was just thinking of your critique of CLT. Well, first of all, CLT is just one of many ways to use wood fiber to make things. So if you were just to suspend that piece and say, can we use fiber from trees to make urban buildings? Are you kind of okay with that and putting our efforts into sort of thinking creatively about how fiber from trees can make urban buildings?
Again, certainly by region, my answer would be different to your question, Scott. But just in case, if we want to think about housing, everybody's kind of pointing to housing. In the US, there's all these articles about a housing crisis, that we need 3 to 5 million housing units. Those are housing starts. Nobody ever talks about that in any of those articles. But if you look at the US Census, the 2020 data, there's 13 to 15 million empty housing units in the US right now. If we want all those people housed at a low carbon cost, low economic cost, you're not talking about new construction for those topics. You're talking about renovation. And we can renovate, we can get those people housed, we can also rehabilitate our forests at the same time if we think about it as a continuous practice, not as diverse industries. So Yes,
complicated.
yes, there will be people living in cities, and they should, and like all the reasons. But we also shouldn't turn our back on the way that we have for the rural U.S., the rural Canada, the rural part of the world. That's exactly why we have the present political predicament that we have, is that the left turned its back on rural America.
Before we get into that,
Yeah. Okay.
maybe a lunch conversation, but I really appreciate the question. No, it is. I mean, we definitely should absolutely have that conversation. It's just we're out of time for this panel. And I would encourage you, I think we all can agree that materials are far more than just aesthetics or capital A architecture, but they are political, they are economic. It is critical that we have this question and this conversation. And so thank you to Alan for bringing these amazing speakers here. Thank you to all of you for speaking and revealing your inner thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.